We are so honored to have as our guest speaker Dr. Christopher Ford, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. He will give us his thoughts on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and some of the false narratives that exist concerning that agreement. Dr. Ford was sworn in as Assistant Secretary on January 9th, 2018. Before that, Dr. Ford served as the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counter-Proliferation at the National Security Council. He began his public service in 1996 as Assistant Counsel to the Intelligence Oversight Board, and during his distinguished career has served on multiple congressional staffs as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department's Bureau of Verification and Compliance, U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation, and as a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Ford also served as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy Reserve from 1994 until 2001, receiving an honorable discharge at the rank of Lieutenant Commander. He's the author of 3 books, scores of articles and monographs. Dr. Ford earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree summa cum laude at Harvard University, a Doctor of Philosophy at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and his degree in law at the Yale Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ford.
Thanks very much, everyone, and good day. It's always a pleasure to be back here at Heritage. In my line of work at the State Department, we manage U.S. relations with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty review process. And in that context, we're coming up on a big anniversary. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of that treaty's entry into force. And that'll be the occasion of a review conference, which will have great symbolic and political significance as a result of that. So in the run-up to that big conference, I'm frequently asked questions about nuclear disarmament, and what more, in particular, what more the United States can do to reassure the international community that we indeed remain faithful to the provisions of the treaty that relate to nuclear disarmament, specifically Article 6 of the treaty and portions of its preamble. So my usual answer to those kinds of questions about what we can do more on disarmament are to focus the questioner upon the challenges that we all face in the security environment right now. These challenges from that environment to the disarmament enterprise are quite real, because as we all know, we are now in a new era of great power competition with the revisionist powers of China and Russia putting pressure upon us and upon our allies in their own bids to remake the international system into something that looks more like their own authoritarian image. And with Russia, for example, seeming to feel free to violate arms control agreements whenever it likes. Not surprisingly, these are challenges for the disarmament enterprise, because, of course, our responsibility first and foremost is to protect the security and advance the interests of the American people. So how does one pursue disarmament in that context is indeed the question of the day. I also tend to point questioners about these topics to the initiative that we in the U.S. have recently rolled out, the so-called Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament initiative. And I point to the multi-party dialogue and working groups that we are in the process of getting underway to bring states together through that process to think more constructively about how it is that we can provide answers to some of these broader security challenges. I also mentioned, in response to such questions, something called the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, or IPNDV, which continues to enjoy broad support as it also brings states together to help explore how to verify, in that particular case, the challenges of verifying that disarmament may have occurred. And so I urge listeners to remember those things, and I also urge them to remember that an enormous amount of disarmament progress has in fact already occurred and been possible by virtue of the easing of tensions at the end of the Cold War, permitting us and our Russian counterparts to draw down our nuclear arsenals by something on the order of between 80 and 90% from their Cold War peaks. So that is important, and I think it is important to draw attention to all of those things and to remember those rather than accepting at face value some of the very easy, facile critiques that are sometimes made for a supposed lack of progress on disarmament. But I think it's also important to clarify the role that disarmament does and does not play in the broader context of NPT diplomacy. You will not be surprised to hear that my interlocutors in dealing with NPT issues will sometimes have suggestions for us about what they say would be a good way for the U.S. to help show its disarmament bona fides, thus contributing to a more successful 2020 review conference for the treaty. Those suggestions, I trust, are always well-intentioned, but they are not always that useful. Sometimes they indeed fail to address or even acknowledge the need to address some of the very deterioration in the international security environment to which I referred earlier. As a result, some of those prescriptions will occasionally miss the mark. And so identifying contemporary international security problems and how they affect the disarmament enterprise and exploring how to help meet those in a way that provides for the kind of safe and stable disarmament that it is, of course, our collective objective to achieve, that's what we're trying to do with the CEND initiative. But in order to make sure that that works, it is sometimes necessary to cut through the underbrush of some of the perhaps confused narratives that are often advanced in the disarmament community in order to get to things that are indeed more likely to be generally productive. So with your permission, I'd like to explore some of that terrain a little bit today. So let me start by outlining a little bit about how we think about the relationship between non-proliferation diplomacy and the disarmament enterprise in the first place. It's sometimes alleged that the U.S. should take certain disarmament-related steps as a way to encourage more non-proliferation cooperation from others. That's a linkage that is often asserted. This appears to be based upon the idea that the structure of the NPT represents a kind of bargain in which the non-nuclear weapon states, as so identified under the treaty, agree to support non-proliferation only conditionally. That is to say, only to the degree that the nuclear weapon states themselves move with what those non-weapon states feel to be sufficient rapidity towards disarmament. Now, this bargain notion is pretty widespread, and it does appeal to certain sort of anti-Western G77 sort of political sentiments. And it was even advanced as one of the justifications for the Obama administration's so-called Prague agenda. But I would submit that this particular interpretation bears very little, if any, relationship to the text or the history of the NPT itself. And I would argue also that this bargain concept also does not reflect the obvious geopolitical reality about which the drafters of the treaty themselves spoke rather clearly. That is to say, it does not reflect that the non-proliferation assurances provided by the NPT offer huge security benefits to all parties. Indeed, it offers such benefits not just to the nuclear weapons states, but particularly to the non-weapon states, which have powerful reasons not to see their neighbors or regional rivals, for example, acquire nuclear weapons. And of course, who by definition, these being non-weapon states I'm talking about, who by definition would lack nuclear tools with which to deter threats from such proliferators if this occurred. So these security benefits for non-proliferation accrue to all parties to the treaty in very profound ways. And it's worth remembering that because it gives non-weapon states a powerful security interest and stake in the success of the treaty and the global non-proliferation regime that is entirely independent of any other factor beyond simply that those assurances themselves. There are many other benefits to the treaty, of course, but even from that perspective alone, it's worth remembering that. But I would argue also that there is no meaningful evidentiary support for the theory that disarmament movement on our part or on other weapons possessors' part is sort of the secret to catalyzing successful non-proliferation cooperation, although the previous U.S. administration seems to have believed that. And of course, we were frequently told that by interlocutors who were trying to use that negotiating point or that rhetorical point as leverage to get us to do more to support their own disarmament agendas. In reality, as research undertaken by the U.S. National Security Laboratories has pointed out, there is indeed little evidence in the academic literature or elsewhere to support such claims of a linkage between disarmament progress and successful non-proliferation diplomacy. I think that assessment is probably correct. In this administration, we explored these assertions rather carefully during our review of disarmament policy in 2017, out of which came the CEND initiative. Now, to begin with, I think there is remarkably little evidence. As we were looking into this, it became clear there was remarkably little evidence that any potential proliferator, if you will, has ever made its decisions about whether to acquire nuclear weapons based upon the nature or the pace of nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapons states. Nor am I aware of any evidence of any country ever having made decisions about whether preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to others was a good idea, simply on the basis of such considerations, which of course is very consistent with my understanding that I mentioned earlier of how, in fact, even on its own terms, the non-proliferation assurances of the treaty provide great benefit to everybody. So if anything, as we realized during the course of our review, the history of the post-Cold War period actually suggests the possibility that disarmament and non-proliferation are correlated in a very different and potentially disturbing way. During the post-Cold War era, we in the US, as I alluded to before, succeeded in reducing our nuclear arsenal by something on the order of 88%. But it's notable that during that very same period, 3 additional countries openly acquired and tested nuclear weapons. 2 additional countries undertook secret nuclear weapons programs, and these were facilitated by an illicit worldwide network that supplied its customers with uranium enrichment technology and even nuclear weapons designs. The resulting threat from North Korean nuclear weapons and from long-range ballistic missiles there, and from Iran's continued possession of capabilities that would allow it to easily resume its push towards weaponization, and the growing nuclear weapons programs in South Asia that face off against each other, all of this has left the non-proliferation community struggling with some very difficult challenges during precisely the period in which post-Cold War arsenals were coming down dramatically, which leads, of course, to some obvious questions about the nature of the correlation, or the connection, if there is one, between disarmament and non-proliferation. So, correlation is not causation, to be sure, and I acknowledge that, but it does suggest that the post-Cold War period of extraordinary and unprecedented disarmament progress by the US and the Russian Federation has also been somewhat surprisingly an era of regression when it comes to non-proliferation. So at the very least, I would suggest this history demonstrates that the relationship between disarmament and non-proliferation, if there is one, is much more complex than the conventional wisdom of the disarmament community would have it. And it certainly debunks the simplistic disarmament progress leads to non-proliferation progress narratives that one hears being advanced so often in NPT circles. Now, to say that, I will freely acknowledge, is not to argue that nuclear weapon states should not pursue what the NPT's Article 6 describes as effective measures to help bring about disarmament. They have committed to pursue those effective measures, and indeed they should, and in fact they have. But it does mean that the complex policy questions of this sort that exist, they resist simple answers. And in fact, I would argue that responsible approaches to disarmament must acknowledge and understand and seek to ameliorate the problems of the global security environment that threaten to make further disarmament progress problematic or even dangerous if such challenges fail to be addressed. So finding ways to do that is precisely the objective of our CE&D initiative. And it's one of the reasons why we hope that serious and thoughtful disarmament advocates will join us in this CE&D exploration. In the meantime, I would argue that it's very important to resist incautious attempts to answer the disarmament mail, if you will, for the urge to demonstrate disarmament good faith by grand gestures can sometimes outrun good sense. And that is why, especially in the run-up to the 2020 review conference for the NPT, I would argue that non-proliferation diplomats need to be prepared to rebut well-meaning efforts to promote disarmament-related narratives or proposals that are not actually likely to work or to contribute to international peace and security as advertised. So let me walk through some of these sort of false narratives, if you will, and debunk them, I hope, to some degree. First and foremost, if we are to build the kind of disarmament dialogue that we need in order to make progress toward the goal, toward that goal in a time of deteriorating security conditions, it is important not to misdiagnose the problem. I can't tell you how many times I have heard the complaint from some disarmament NGOs, for example, and sometimes from otherwise responsible international interlocutors, that things like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called ban treaty, that these things are necessary today because of a terrible lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. Some have even gone so far to say that such radical attempts at a solution are necessary because there has hitherto been no progress on disarmament. Taking it a step even further, some years ago, the then head of the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs actually declared to me in official capacity that the US should be given no credit for its nuclear reductions since the end of the Cold War because the end of that period of tension and of conflict had reduced our need for such weapons. We should not be given disarmament credit for getting rid of them, he contended, because dismantling weapons we no longer needed in order to safeguard our national security didn't count as disarmament. His implications seem to be that it only counts as disarmament if you get rid of weapons that you do need. That is to say, if you risk committing national suicide. Now, such an assertion is obviously incorrect, and the idea that disarmament only counts if it harms your security is simply absurd. As I've noted, the truth is that both the US and the Russians have reduced their nuclear arsenals by between 80 and 90% from their Cold War peak. I mentioned the 88% figure on our part. And as I'd like to point out, 88% is a lot. If you think 88% is not real progress on disarmament, I would suggest, as I sometimes do for a laugh line, imagine coming to work having removed 88% of your clothes tomorrow morning, and how would your colleagues react? This is a significant figure. Imagine trying to live having lost 88% of your salary. So we should not pretend that that is not a very significant thing. Clearly, disarmament progress of an enormously impressive sort has occurred. And while I fully understand that many would like more progress still, to pretend that what has been accomplished to date at huge difficulty and expense, I should add, is meaningless, that is not just unfair, although of course it is unfair, it is also false and deeply pernicious. I don't just mean that pretending that all of this amounts to do nothing is unfair, though it is. Most significantly, it is actually dangerous to pretend that. For the disarmament community to tell weapons possessors that reductions of such a scale are essentially meaningless, just because the world is not yet to zero. Such messages, if they were to be taken in that fashion, risk damaging the disarmament enterprise in a profound way and discrediting the disarmament movement. Such messages risk signaling that the disarmament movement is actually not about achieving a better and safer world, but rather simply using a virtue signaling discourse to undermine the security interests of the weapons possessors themselves. That is no way to build the kind of dialogue and good faith engagement that we all need on these issues if disarmament is in fact to become a reality as we have pledged to try to make it through Article 6 and the Preamble of the NPT. So, credit should be given where credit is due, and weapons possessors who get rid of weapons they no longer need should absolutely be given credit and praise for doing so, especially when this, as in the case of the US, for instance, is the result of a continual reassessment of how deterrence can be maintained at the lowest possible level that prudence allows. This is what the disarmament movement should in fact be all about, and indeed there is scarcely any other way to imagine disarmament actually ever happening. Our collective global security objective should be to gradually build a world in which no one feels that they need such tools any longer, because that's how such tools will go away if indeed they do. So the narrative that it only counts as disarmament to get rid of weapons without which one's national existence or those of one's allies would be or could be imperiled, that is a narrative that just encourages responsible listeners to ignore and distrust the speaker. The world deserves better than that, and the disarmament enterprise deserves better than that. So, another set of confusions, if you will, that I think it is necessary to correct in order to improve the odds of making continued progress relates to how to deal today with states' expressed understandings in years past of the optimal disarmament agenda. When countries come together in fora such as the NPT review conferences, it is understandable for them to articulate and to express their commitment to pursuing whatever disarmament-related steps they think make the most sense in view of the circumstances that they face at the time. That's quite reasonable. But it's also important to keep an open mind about such things, since the world has a habit, of course, of changing over time, and there is no guarantee that what makes sense at one point will invariably make sense at a later point, under different conditions, potentially. So if our various diplomatic delegations are indeed doing their job, I would expect that the majority of such past pronouncements, in fact, about collective disarmament aspirations would generally still make sense over time. But especially where conditions in the global security environment are changing rapidly or significantly, it would also be surprising if all such past pronouncements always did. So I would argue that thoughtful proponents of disarmament need to acknowledge this, and they should understand it to be part of our collective responsibilities to curate and to adjust the policy agenda to ensure that it remains as relevant as possible in light of changing conditions. After all, an uncritical, reflexive adherence to yesterday's agenda, where changes have occurred in the intervening period, is likely to discredit the disarmament community and to make real progress more difficult. As an example, as part of the 13 practical steps, as they were called, agreed at the 2000 NPT review conference, it was urged that the US and Russia implement START 2, the Arms Control Treaty, negotiate START 3, and strengthen the ABM Treaty, none of which exists today. START 2, of course, was negotiated, ratified, but never entered into force. The US withdrew from the ABM Treaty in order to respond to emerging threats from North Korean and Iranian missiles. The START 3 negotiations never actually got going in the first place. And so, does it make sense today to consider all of those 13 steps to be canonical wisdom as if chiseled in stone coming down from Sinai? I wouldn't think so. And yet the 2010 review conference explicitly reaffirmed the continued validity of the practical steps agreed to in 2000. This isn't necessarily the way to do this right, folks. And I would argue that a serious disarmament agenda for the present day must be willing to reassess its understandings as the world changes. That doesn't mean reflexively disregarding past policy commitments, but it also means not reflexively endorsing them either. Article 6 does not require any particular concrete steps, Article 6 of the NPT, and indeed the treaty's negotiating record is replete with repeated rejections of efforts to require them. Instead, what Article 6 does do is enjoin all states to work together to move toward disarmament, specifically to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to disarmament. And it leaves it to the judgment of future decision makers how best to do this under the prevailing circumstances of any given time. It is our duty, I would argue, to live up to that responsibility that has been given to all of us by working to ensure that our policy agenda is one that effectively engages with and addresses the issues and the challenges of our time. How our predecessors felt it best to engage and address the challenges of their time is, of course, quite relevant, but it should not be a priori dispositive. This is a responsibility for all weapon states, but not just them. It is for all states as well, as Article 6 also makes clear. The founders, the drafters of the treaty thought of that part too. And it is essential that we seek, as they enjoin us to do, genuinely effective measures and not ones just that adhere to past formulations simply because there are past formulations. The nuclear weapon states have expressed an unequivocal commitment to disarmament, but this does not absolve anyone of the responsibility for ensuring that the measures that we seek to actually achieve are in fact effective in light of current circumstances. By analogy, for example, one might be unequivocally committed, if you will, to getting to the other side of town, as I did a few minutes ago to come here to Heritage. But it would be madness to press blindly forward irrespective of where each road actually leads, or where there are sinkholes, or road congestion, or oncoming traffic when you wish to turn. If disarmament is important enough to pursue, and we are all agreed, I hope that it is something that is important enough to pursue with care and with prudence, and to contend that one should simply press forward in a straight line irrespective of the terrain is a sign of unseriousness. Let me turn to a different issue. There are probably many other disarmament narratives that probably richly deserve debunking as we seek to find a genuinely constructive way to move forward. And I won't trouble you with a long laundry list, but I would like to say a final word in this regard about a concept that is raised from time to time and that perhaps enjoys a kind of superficial appeal. Well, it is one, unfortunately, that is also based upon some important misunderstandings, and that if adopted by the U.S. could actually impede rather than advance the disarmament progress that is envisioned in the NPT. I refer to the question of whether the United States should adopt a so-called no first use policy for nuclear weapons, or NFU, if you will. In the years after the end of the Cold War, the question of whether to make NFU into U.S. policy has come up several times. The Obama administration, for instance, flirted with declaring that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to defend against other nuclear weapons, a concept which is basically NFU and mufti, if you will, and a concept that former Secretary of Defense William Perry has explicitly explained was in fact developed as a way to rebrand no first use so that it could be sold under a different label, sub silentio, if you will, to American audiences. But in the end, even for them, that notion was still found wanting, and indeed it has consistently been dismissed by administrations in Washington of both parties as being both deeply unwise and as being inimical to U.S. interests. Nevertheless, NFU still bubbles up from time to time. In fact, it is, unfortunately for its proponents, no better an idea today than it was before. And if anything, I would argue that an NFU declaration by the U.S. today would probably actually be even more problematic now than at any other time since the Cold War ended. As for the idea that a lack of having a no first use pledge has harmed our non-proliferation policy, this is easily dispensed with, much as the broader question of disarmament progress being connected to non-proliferation progress that I discussed a few minutes ago. For there is no evidence of such a connection. And even if a lack of NFU were to have some vague chilling effect upon disarmament diplomacy, it is still, I would argue, a poor basis upon which to make strategic posture decisions in an arena of potentially existential questions about how to prevent great power war. Now, as for the claim that NFU provides predictability, which is sometimes made, I think in practice it would do no such thing, and indeed that it might have the real effect of increasing rather than lessening uncertainty and adversary distrust, and might make it harder to achieve the kind of clarity about posture and doctrinal thinking that we think it is important to have in order for the weapons possessors of the world to help address their stability problems. Now, as a general rule, I'll try to explain these points. As a general rule, nuclear weapons possessors that face significant non-nuclear threats, such as the danger of a large-scale conventional invasion, for example, or an assault with chemical, biological, or perhaps cyber weapons that could have strategic crippling effect, or perhaps countries that wish to deter aggression against their allies who face such threats, those countries, historically, and I think very understandably, tend to opt against NFU policies. Because to adopt a no first use policy, after all, would be to proclaim that you will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons to deter any non-nuclear threat, no matter how great it might be. Now, precisely because successive generations of U.S. leaders have cared so deeply and consistently about preserving the integrity of U.S. nuclear umbrella alliance networks in Europe and in East Asia, the United States has always eschewed no first use. This was especially important during the Cold War, but it remains important in the current era, especially since we see so much of worsening great power competition in regional theaters where Russia and China enjoy local advantages in conventional forces vis-a-vis U.S. allies that they seek to intimidate in hopes of dividing us from them and ultimately decoupling those allies from our deterrent umbrella. In that particular context, today, I would argue that a NFU declaration would be desperately unwise. It would be a blow to the heart of our alliance system. It would be a potential signal to would-be regional aggressors, as well as to our friends, that we do not intend fully to defend our alliance partners. And it would be a repudiation of decades of bipartisan and transoceanic good sense and agreement upon one of the most important planks of U.S. foreign and national security policy. Historically, at least, it tends to be nuclear-armed countries which perceive themselves to possess an overwhelming non-nuclear advantage. Or perhaps those who want rather cynically to increase the pressure upon a nuclear-armed ally not to defend itself, who tend to find no first use attractive. Perhaps the most interesting case study here is the Soviet no first use pledge made by Leonid Brezhnev in 1982. This pledge was an entirely dishonest promise designed to help encourage the nuclear freeze movement in the West, to undermine the nuclear deterrence upon which NATO allies relied in order to deter invasion by the armored columns that reported to that very same Leonid Brezhnev, and in fact to persuade the NATO alliance not to respond to Moscow's deployment of SS-20 missiles, hundreds of them. The Soviet NFU pledge was a promise, in fact, that the Soviets themselves never meant to keep in the first place, as we now know, thanks to subsequent post-Cold War declassification of information about what their actual war planning, in fact, was. Now, the Brezhnev example, I would argue, demonstrates how no first use can actually undermine deterrence and stability, and how feel-good virtue signaling in nuclear policy can sometimes be weaponized for political ends and cynical ends. Now, especially in light of the continuing importance of our alliance relationships today and the worsening threat of revisionist aggression in local theaters where our own forces are somewhat thin on the ground, I would encourage those in the West who may be tempted to take the NFU idea seriously to think these things through rather carefully. It is worth asking whether our security and international peace and security would really benefit if we proclaimed an NFU policy and that both our allies and our adversaries actually believed it. I submit that that would not be an improvement. But that, of course, also brings us to the question of whether our allies and adversaries would, in fact, believe it if we proclaimed NFU. And there lies another one of NFU's problems. As a mere statement of policy choice, if you will, having a no first use doctrine is basically just a statement of intent, and it is something that can be undone just as easily as it can be proclaimed, without any advanced requirement of notice, of course, if any at all. Since it could be changed on a whim, NFU might be a signal potent enough to convince our allies that we are not very serious about defending them, but it is very difficult to see how any adversary would place any significant reliance in such a promise. After all, if a nuclear-armed state faced an overwhelming conventional invasion, for example, or it faced a strategically crippling non-nuclear attack with some other form of WMD or whatever, how reasonable is it to expect that that country would really abjure using, or at least threatening to use, the nuclear weapons that it has in its possession in order to save itself? I would think that to ask this question is actually to answer it. In the kind of circumstances in which NFU would matter most between adversaries who have nuclear weapons, a bare no first use declaration can be relied upon the least. NFU, after all, is just a statement. It's not a suicide note. Now, this goes to the heart of why NFU would not, in fact, provide the predictability in a crisis that some of its advocates contend that it would. Now, to be sure, There presumably are circumstances in which an NFU declaration would be very credible indeed. But these are not the circumstances that anyone cares very much about. For example, no one would question a U.S. promise not to use nuclear weapons first against our closest treaty allies. But the circumstances that would make that declaration credible are not ones that make it, they are ones that make it entirely unnecessary to start with. That kind of an NFU promise would be obviously reliable because we are obviously close allies and friends with those countries anyway. And between us, there wouldn't be problems that would arise to raise those questions at all. So, where it is most credible, it is least necessary. And where it is most necessary, it is least credible. That is not a recipe for success. Now, if anything, the example of the old 1982 pledge from Leonid Brezhnev suggests that the effort to claim credit for an NFU policy could actually contribute to unpredictability and distrust in a deterrence relationship. I can't imagine, for example, that Moscow or Beijing would feel any more reassured by a U.S. NFU pledge, if I made one today, for example, than they would before. To the contrary, actually, having themselves both some experience with questionable NFU promises, they might feel more insecure and distrustful at the game that we would obviously be trying to play, in their view. They would see our own NFU claims as a kind of dishonest and manipulative opacity, if you will, that moves away from the kind of transparency and confidence building and engagement on issues of doctrine and posture that we have been, I think, quite correctly trying to encourage in the strategic arena and to elicit from our nuclear competitors. Worse, given the Kremlin's weird fears of some kind of invasion by NATO, of all things, a declaration of NFU policy might be interpreted in Moscow as being exactly what it was that Leonid Brezhnev attempted in 1982. That is to say, a stunt to delegitimize an adversary's potential use of nuclear weapons to deter conventional aggression. So, while I would posit that the worst case scenario would actually be if our great power adversaries actually believed an NFU declaration, in which case they might feel much more free to threaten our allies in some fashion with non-nuclear force, the alternative scenario would also be quite bad. It would lead to adversaries who are more distrusting of our intentions than before, and even less willing to engage with us on transparency and confidence-building measures in strategic policy. And since our nuclear umbrella, allies might quite plausibly take even a strategically non-credible NFU declaration as a clear message that Washington now finds it distasteful to contemplate using nuclear weapons to defend them, we would in the process have ripped asunder our most valuable alliance relationships. Moreover, in articulating contempt for ally reassuring extended deterrence that we have tried to maintain for so many decades, an NFU declaration could undo generations of U.S. non-proliferation policy, undermining the proliferation disincentives that are provided by our alliance relationships, and signaling to any current allies who think that nuclear weapons are still needed to deter aggression against them that it might be time for them to start building such weapons themselves. So, on the whole, I would argue that an U.S. NFU declaration would be, for all of these reasons, a terrible idea. For all the potential feel-good psychology of NFU, its reality would be, I fear, only sordid and problematic, ushering us into nuclear weapons relationships that are more unstable, less predictable, and more untrusting than at present, transforming our alliance relationships at the same time into ones that are weaker and more tenuous than today, and making nuclear proliferation and indeed nuclear war perhaps more likely. So, as we seek through the CEND process our new initiative for dialogue and disarmament, to build a serious engagement with parties around the world to address the myriad security challenges that make disarmament progress difficult, I think we must encourage thoughtful consideration of all such issues, but we must also be willing, where necessary, to point out the flaws in some of the traditional rhetorical reflexes, of the disarmament community. Finding a sound way forward requires cutting through such underbrush, even if doing so cuts somewhat against the conventional wisdom of political correctness. We are trying to chart a path along these lines with our CEND initiative and the working group that we are establishing under its auspices. As we move forward toward the 2020 review conference of the NPT, I hope that more and more international counterparts will join us in trying to address these issues thoughtfully, with seriousness, and with an open mind. By trying to debunk some of these false narratives, I mean to take no position hostile to the disarmament enterprise, and indeed a position fundamentally friendly to that enterprise, because it is only by getting through those confusions and debunking those false paths and wrong roadways that we stand a chance of being able to work together with our international partners to find a way that genuinely and productively works toward a safer and more secure world that is ultimately free of nuclear weapons in ways that are both consistent with international peace and security, our own interests, and the safe and sustainable maintenance of that kind of a world. It is no easy challenge, but part of it requires the kind of intellectual honesty that I've tried to catalyze a little bit today, and I hope that perhaps we can have some questions and answers about how to try to do that in the months and the years ahead. So thank you very much for the patience of listening to a very long set of remarks, and thank you for all of that. I'd be happy to try to take some questions, but I understand we may be cutting off the live stream. I would appreciate if we could be under Chatham House rules for the following bits. Thanks very much. So here's where you get to play Stump the Chump. And
So I'm going to get a thumbs up from the guys in the back here that we've, good, okay. So, yeah, so that part was live streamed and will be available on our website for posterity. And Dr. Ford, I aspire to your eloquence, but I don't think I'll ever arrive at that spot. But wonderful remarks. I'm going to ask the group for some questions here. Before we do that, I have one, and that is at the 50th Review Conference, of which I am dimly aware. You talked about how our negotiators will have to at least, play defensive against a set of ideas that could be, false, kooky, whatever. Are there proposals that the U.S. delegation seeks to advance, ideas that we hope to get considered by the group while we're at that conference? Thank you.
Sure. Well, our diplomacy leading up to the review conference centers around a number of sort of key elements. With respect to disarmament, which I was talking a little bit about today, in order to try to encourage open minds about what roads to not pursue, because they don't seem to be very promising ones. In the disarmament arena, we are very much in the business of promoting this initiative that I referred to, the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament Initiative, or CEND. We plan to have a plenary meeting of something called the CEND Working Group, probably, and then, well, it'll be in, good Lord, I'm forgetting now, is it June or July? Early July, that's right, at which we will be bringing partners in this dialogue process together from around the world to sit down and try to begin explorations of what sorts of problems in the security environment stand in the way of future disarmament progress, right? This is part of that idea of effective measures that I referred to in my remarks. A phrase that comes from Article 6 of the treaty. What measures actually are effective? To understand that, you have to understand what the obstacles are. And then, of course, what we're trying to do with this is bring partners representing a range of perspectives and geographies and roles in the world to come together to explore what those challenges are that impede further or faster disarmament progress, and what possible solutions there might be to that. How is it that we can conceptualize a pathway from the present day and all of the challenges that we see in the world around us to a world in which eventually we have achieved the goals articulated in the NPT with respect to disarmament. That is not the kind of thing that any one country can sort of dictate about or to others in connection with. So the objective of this is to bring folks together with open minds and hopefully an interest and commitment to creative and thoughtful and respectful dialogue on this, and see where it goes. It's up to the group to set its agenda. We have had some suggestions, which we outlined publicly at the preparatory committee meeting a few weeks ago. But that's the centerpiece of our disarmament narrative. I hope we don't have to spend too much time playing defensive ball against bad ideas, but it will be necessary. It always is to some extent. But rather than just playing defense ball, which is necessary, but fundamentally, that's not the best answer. The best answer is to be a creative contributor to this arena, and that's what we are trying to do with CEND, and we hope that others will join us in that. And by the time the review conference actually starts, a little bit less than a year from now, we will already have had meetings of this working group process starting to occur, and we'll hopefully be able to have participants in this being able to speak to what I imagine and certainly hope they will find to be a very exciting and promising dialogue structure to take this engagement forward. On other aspects of our diplomacy leading up to the review conference, we're stressing the importance of remembering the benefits that the treaty has brought to all of its parties, and indeed to mankind more generally, in terms of promoting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. That's an important part of what the treaty describes as its own sort of mission set, if you will. And indeed, the world has seen a great deal of progress in this respect, not only in the spread of nuclear power generation, of course, but also in a whole range of projects that the International Atomic Energy Agency supports, for example, and that we also support both through them and bilaterally, in sharing the benefits that applications of nuclear technology can bring, whether it is in things like medical research, industry, agriculture, health sciences, desalinization. I mean, there are a whole range of ways in which nuclear technology in the past 70 or 80 years has made human flourishing much more possible. And there are enormously elaborate and very successful international programs that exist and that we fund. We're the largest contributor to these things, I should say, with some pride on behalf of the US government, that serve to help countries, peoples around the world, especially in the developing world, who are the least able to do these things for themselves in some cases, take advantage of all that. So reminding everyone of those benefits and what the treaty process has brought, what the global non-proliferation regime that has been built up around the NPT has brought, remembering all those benefits is, I think, a key to sustaining the treaty's success in the future, because it helps remind everybody why they all have so much of a powerful stake in continuing to maintain the integrity of that system. So that's a piece of our diplomacy as well. We certainly continue to focus upon ensuring that the non-proliferation regime continues to be a non-proliferation regime. And that means working to ensure that safeguards are carefully observed, the best possible standards of safeguards authorities are in place everywhere. Universalize the IAEA's additional protocol, for example. Make it a condition of nuclear supply so that no one gets to acquire nuclear technology without being held to proper standards for how to safely keep it and keep it from being diverted, standards of safety and security. All of these things are part of what makes it possible for those benefits to be available on a global basis. So we want to ensure that people remember that from their own self-interest perspective, and also from the perspective of how all of this contributes to international peace and security in such profound ways. That's a sprawling overview of our diplomatic message, but I think we have a lot of very good, close, like-minded partners in helping spreading this word, and I hope that we can, even in the area of disarmament, which is traditionally a sort of a defensive game from a weapons possessor's perspective, I think we can actually have a very positive message for everyone and get the treaty off on a good foot for its second half century.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone, and if you happen to give us your name and affiliation, if you don't mind. So the lady right here, if you don't mind. Yeah, there we go. Thanks. Yeah, no, wasn't her. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ford,
Just a
for
reminder,
your remarks.
part of it is off the record.
Connie from Voice of America. I want to ask about North Korea's recent missile launches. There has been concerns that it bears resemblance to Russia's missiles. Are there any implications to this in terms of proliferation? Has this been discussed with Russia? And if I could just add one more question. So monitoring of ship-to-ship transfers have been significantly stressed in this current administration. How has the U.S. cooperation of pressuring North Korea changed in the current administration?
Okay, on the question of the recent launches, I would have to refer you to, I suppose it would be intelligence community folks on that. There has been quite a bit of, actually quite good open source discussion of that, but it's hard when you're in a position such as mine to always disaggregate what you've heard from where. And I also don't want to be in the business of seeming to confirm, for example, open source analysis done by some clever folks at some website. Because I'm not supposed to be in the business of confirming or denying things, right? They may be right or they may be wrong, but it's safer if I not get into that. So I'll have to defer to that, to whatever official pronouncements there have been. Obviously, in principle, it's easy to say that we're watching such things very, very closely and very keen to keeping an eye on the proliferation implications of this, if there are any, and of course also how these launches fit into the North Koreans' broader strategy of sort of trying to use such things as the fodder for potential negotiating leverage when we hopefully get back to the table with them soon, or when they come back to the table, I should say, with us. But I can't say much more about that. On ship-to-ship transfers, that has been a huge priority for us. We have it's actually quite a very well-developed apparatus for trying to, in effect, do the well, it's a little bit like you almost imagine like an international kind of CSI show, right? I mean, you imagine that there's a maritime patrol plane flying somewhere over the ocean off of East Asia, and they see two ships in the dead of night next to each other, passing things back and forth, and you get sort of blurry, not super, but often helpful image of it, and so there's a thing going on, but you don't know exactly what it is, and a detective process ensues. And analysts will pore over this, and other types of information will be turned to, and eventually, perhaps you'll figure out that this is the such and such a ship that is North Korean registered, and it was last seen at some particular port from which coal is usually uploaded to sell overseas, often to China, notwithstanding what the rules should be, and then you sort of try to track down who the other ship is. You eventually figure out who they are, and of course this has to get through layers of obfuscation. They may have painted over the names in the back of the vessels and changed them to fake names. They may have changed the IMO numbers. They may have their required transponders. They may turn them off or spoof them or play games like that. And you go through this whole sort of CSI investigative process to figure out who the players are. And then the diplomatic fun begins, because then we get to go overseas and send teams around to gradually turn off the lights and all the support systems that keep the recipient vessels, for example, going. There's only so much you can do against the North Korean vessels themselves, although sometimes one can apparently seize them. One hears from the news. No comment. But with respect to those who are supporting that trade and being the facilitator vessels, the recipients, they will be registered someplace. So if this other vessel, let's say it's the SS Ford. So the SS Ford is registered in, I don't know, Panama. So I go to Panama and I say, hey, I can prove here that you have a vessel under your flag that is a sanctions evader. And that's a big problem. Let's say we go to the internet, to the UN, and we get this vessel designated as a sort of officially involved in sanctions evasion from the UN Security Council Resolution 1718 Committee. We then get to go to Panama and say, hey, the Ford is doing this bad stuff. It's a designated vessel. You are required by international law to sort of disavow it or whatever. And so the Panamanians will say, oh, didn't know that. We are yanking their flag registration. So all of a sudden the Ford is stateless. That's cool. That's a step that makes it very difficult to operate. You're sort of kind of technically a pirate in some sense on the high seas. You go to, let's say it's Lloyd's of London happens to insure the Ford, and you tell them, like, did you know that one of your ships is actually engaged in this stuff? And Lloyd says, oh crap, I didn't know that. That's completely against our rules, and they yank the insurance policy. The seaworthiness certification folks in some other country may yank the seaworthiness certification, and word is starting to get around that you should not deal with this vessel. And oh, by the way, if they've been designated by the committee in New York, you are required by international law to seize it if it lands in your port. So if it happens to end up in somebody's port, we show up in the capital and say, guess what? You got a ship in your port that you are required to seize. And maybe they do, right? And so this game ensues where we essentially chase the ship-to-ship transfer perpetrators around the world and try to shut them down. Now, it's hard. Doesn't always work. People don't always cooperate with us all the time. And there are still lots of vessels out there trying to do this. But we are making it as hard, as costly, as slow, and as risky for them to operate as it's possible to do. And we're having, I think, a significant impact. And that's only after we forced the North Koreans into using such means of resupply in the first place. As an old Navy guy, it's not hard to imagine that transferring bulk cargo in the middle of the night on the high seas, trying to evade surveillance planes, is an awfully risky and problematic endeavor, and it is a really terrible way to fund your national economy. There are much better ways to do that. And the fact that we forced them to use these tools in the first place is a sign of significant progress in putting a massive squeeze on the North Korean economy as a means to incentivize them to give the right answer and finally agree to implement their denuclearization promises. So the fact that we have to worry about STS stuff in the first place is a good sign, and we're doing a lot of really good work to chase the bad guys around the seas of the world and make their life very complicated. So this is actually exciting and fun work. It's one of the more dynamic pieces of what we do at the State Department in my particular lane, and thank you for the chance to talk about it. It's exciting stuff.
Hyewon from Radio Free Asia. And do you think the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will eventually give up all his nuclear weapons and return to the NPT?
I certainly hope so. I'm not a prophet. I don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to say, but it is our objective to make it as attractive a choice for him as possible. In two respects. First of all, we want to make it as unattractive as possible to continue on his current path of not implementing the promises that he made in Singapore to denuclearize. That means putting a lot of pressure on him and keeping him and his regime in a position where they face the prospect of that pressure continuing indefinitely unless they make a different strategic choice about cooperating with us in the diplomatic process. So that's the first part of the game. But the second part of this is to make it as attractive as possible for him to say yes in a positive way. And that, of course, is where the relaxation of all that pressure comes. And he seems to be very committed, as our president has signaled he appreciates many times, very committed to trying to develop the economic possibilities of North Korea and to build some kind of a better and brighter future of some degree of engagement with the world. The Chinese have been encouraging him to think about the Chinese model of economic growth for a while. I don't know how that's received exactly, but we want to make it clear that our objective is not to foreclose that kind of a prosperous future for North Korea. Indeed, we're happy to help facilitate it, but there's some things you got to do first. And unless and until you do those things, there will be a great deal of pain and pressure that is not going to go away. And so we hope that, I don't know what he will do is the short answer, but we want to make the right choice as appealing as possible.
Thank you. Hi. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And I was at the NPT for 9 of the 10 days and went to...
I saw you at the CND side event.
Yes.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thanks. And I've been to all the NPTs in New York since 2000. And this time, as I told you there, I was representing civil society, Transcend International, which is a network of conflict transformation, mediators beyond borders, and psychologists for social responsibility. So I think that our missions, in my impression, and I hope I'm right, are aligned with the mission of SEND to create an environment conducive to nuclear disarmament. I have a few comments about some of your points, but unlike most of my fellow NGOs, I think it's a great initiative, and
So a backhanded compliment, but that's cool.
Right.
I'll take it.
No, I think it's, and I've been thinking along proposing something similar that the nuclear weapons are a symptom, and we need to deal with the underlying conflicts and reduce tension, and then that creates an environment. So just, I guess 2 points. One, I don't disagree with your comments about no first use, but in addition, I remember something from many years ago in terms of perception. Like we're looking at our own security needs, and we also need to look at how our actions for our own security needs create impressions, affect others and
Sure.
their security needs. So that there was a belief that, we wouldn't, that we were planning for second strike. So that if we didn't agree to no first use, then other people would perceive us that we could make a first strike, and then if the ABM, if they would make a second strike, then so it was perceived in a way that increased distrust. So I'm just talking about perceptions that we have to take into consideration, and then you said that we need to adjust our policy to current conditions, which I agree with, but I think also, if I understand CEND, that we're creating conditions
Also true.
to make it easy or to adjust our policy better. And like the example you gave that, our allies aren't worried about no first use. So just to improve the underlying relationships and to analyze. So, and my question is that I'm starting something that's similar called Coalition for Second Order Change. So first order change is dealing with the symptom, like eliminating the weapons. The other one is, what's the conflict about? What do the parties want? What are legitimate goals? How can you reduce tension? Improving communication.
What sort of question can I ask?
Is that consistent with your mission of SEND?
Well, I think what we're finding as we move forward with the CEND initiative, actually SEND is an easier way to say it, that's why I might as well, I should get used to that, is that there are actually a lot more synergies here in dealing with interlocutors in the disarmament community than perhaps people, they or perhaps we had expected, and that's always good news. My hope with this, let me back out a little bit. I think many of these questions about how to create an environment that is more conducive to disarmament progress are ones on which a wide variety of participants in these debates can actually agree upon, at least for a while. I even say this to friends of mine who may be deeply skeptical or maybe even hostile to the disarmament enterprise at all. And my point to them, for example, is that, well, whatever you think about the achievability or the sustainability of the end state, and maybe you have some concerns about whether that's actually available, whatever you think about that, there are things in the short run that are important and viable from anyone's perspective that the things we should be doing to make the environment one that is more conducive to disarmament progress are also things simply that make the international environment a more secure one. And that should be good whether you believe that the end state is achievable or not. And so at least for the moment, I'm trying to build a coalition for now. Maybe people will jump off the bus later. Who knows? We'll see what happens. That's a long time from now. For now, I think there's a great deal, at least there should be, a great deal that we can agree upon and work together productively towards achieving in the sort of short to medium term that will be unequivocally of benefit to everybody, no matter what you think about the broader kinds of things. And they may not be the conventional wisdom litmus test issues that you will find in an old review conference final document. I don't know. We'll have to see what the participants sort of come up with. But it's that kind of finding of policy coincidence, at least for a while, that I think can actually indeed help make the world a better place in ways that are going to suit everyone's agenda. Like the skeptical hawks who don't think disarmament's going to make sense ultimately anyway, I'm sure they'd be happier to have a more secure world. The disarmament folks surely must see, the true believers must surely see that the only viable way to get to that kind of an end state is through a process of making the world safer in ways that will make it even imaginable for weapons possessors to eliminate their holdings. So let's just work on that agenda for a while, and the fact that we don't all agree about the end state, that's fine, we'll deal with that later. But we got stuff we got to do because the world's not going in a good direction right now. So the lady in the back in the white sweater has actually been super patient. She had the first hand up, if I could just, sorry. We can talk afterwards, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Alicia Dressman. Chris, I wanted to discuss with you parallel initiatives to the NPT that have come out of this administration. Of course, we recently saw a trilateral push with China and Russia from the administration. I know that's not necessarily your lane or your brief. And it confused me because I know that China has not been enthusiastic in engaging with Russia on the INF Treaty for the last decade. I know that Russia has a whole suite of preconditions to any follow-on arms control treaty with us. So I was kind of confused about this initiative coming out of the administration, and if you could bring any clarity to the intentions behind engaging the Chinese and the Russians, and how that would perhaps fold into our commitments to the NPT. Thank you.
Well, you're quite correct. Disarmament is not my official lane in the road at the department, and it's probably safer if I not get down that road too far in light of current events that aren't really my responsibility. I will say that in late 17, when it still was my responsibility, we did say officially that we raised the issue publicly of how to envision a future for arms control, and to the degree that this is not sort of my recollection of this, my knowledge and my involvement is dated. But back at that point, we made and I think you can probably find it on the web someplace. But when I was at the NSC staff, we did say publicly that we encourage people to think about if there's a future for arms control in this particular security environment right now, which is not going in a particularly good direction, and in which the participants that you would presumably somehow need to engage, not as to say not just us and the Russians, but perhaps the Chinese or perhaps others, when they're not all on the same kind of more or less parity business that we got used to. I mean, we got used to during the Cold War to focusing arms control upon negotiating details between folks who are more or less in the same sort of structural place. That isn't true if you start, that can't, at least I hope it's not ever true, at least not unless we all come down in some fashion, but that's not true if you abstract out to larger numbers of people. And so what we were doing at the time was encouraging people to think about if there is a future for arms control, is it really in the traditional numerical bean counting, or is it, at least for the moment, more usefully something to be pursued that looks at issues of how do we, not so much numbers of weapons, but numbers of what? Like what kind of, what choices are being made about what delivery systems or modalities to use? What are doctrinal and posture choices? How do those things relate to each other? What choices in those regards are less or more stabilizing or destabilizing? I mean, arms control used to be, back many years ago, it used to be about how to manage a sort of dangerous and poisonous nuclear standoff. That's how it got started. We got accustomed to thinking of arms control after the Cold War as being a mechanism for reducing. And when you can do that, that's great. But when you can't do that, or when it's challenging, at least I should say, we should remember that from the Cold War, we should know that arms control is also a powerful tool for managing the risks and dangers of relationship. We had negotiations with the Soviets about, to some degree, about what types of system it is safer or less safe to be pursuing. We had negotiations about how to manage conflict situations. We had incidents at sea agreements to keep, to do what we could to keep, episodes that happened out in the real world from escalating. There are types of engagements that we used to do much more of, or that others could perhaps do more of and haven't done yet now in the modern world, that can contribute dramatically to stability and to helping set a sort of stable baseline from which it's possible to have a discussion about eventual disarmament. That is much more difficult to have if everyone is sort of climbing up and sort of standing off with each other. So there are things we can remember about how to use these tools to manage relationships that we may want to crack that box open again and think about how we can apply some of that wisdom from the past to contemporary challenges. Because if we aren't willing to do that, and if we obsess simply about, if the question is, when are you and the Russians going to get together and go from 1,550 operationally deployed warheads under New START to 600? You're going to wait by the phone a long time for that if you don't address a lot of things in the real world. So that's what CE&D is designed to do, is to focus people back upon that problem of how do you address the underlying challenges, as Diane was saying a moment ago. And while you do that, you should relearn some lessons about arms control that are not just numerical, that are about how you manage the stability dangers and the escalation risks and the misunderstanding risks and whatever else it may be of a nuclear deterrent standoff, because you're going to need to do that for a while until you can solve those bigger picture issues. That's at least what we suggested in late 2017 might be an interesting way to think about the possible future for disarmament, or for arms control. But full caveats, that was as of then, and I can't speak for the department now. So.
Wonderful.
Thanks very much, folks.